and received over 20 patents, including sports analytics, deep learning, and interpretability, easy for you to say. Please welcome Rajiv Singh, Adjunct Assistant Professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, Machine Learning Engineer at Hugging Face. Please put your hands together for Rajiv.
Thank you so much. Whew. It's a bit overwhelming to be here and to see all of you. 10 years ago, I was crawling around under computer desks, setting up computers, working at an IT help desk. And at that point, I decided I needed to do a career change. I needed to do something different. I saw data science. I remember studying statistics back when I was back in graduate school. So I dusted off that statistics textbook, thinking, why not get into it? And I looked up the old software that I used to use when I was in statistics, but quickly ran into a stumbling block. No sound. It cost a lot of money to use. I then found Andrew Ng's machine learning course. Right? I think there's many of us that have found that. About 5 million of us have used that. And one of the decisions he made in his course was not to use MATLAB, but to use an open source product for it. And one of the things I've seen in my career, whether learning data science or working in an enterprise setting using data science, is just a wealth of open source tools I've used. And these open source tools have followed me as I started working with tabular data, then later doing work with images, whether it's a simple dog, cat, or if you're doing something like trying to identify if somebody's falling asleep in a car. And the progress has been immense. We saw this with the earlier speakers, but just the amazing things that you can do now, where you can take a napkin, right, hand code some stuff, and literally the latest models will now turn that into workable code. Just amazing stuff. And I think we saw already from the earlier two speakers today, just amazing applications of this, how we can use language models to answer questions. Code completion, we'll talk about this later. It's a great application. The multimodal, all the visual multimodal stuff. Even doing things like protein analysis with these models. It's an amazing time we live in. I want to share one of my favorite applications. So take a look at this. Think about, how would you do this? How would you solve this if I asked you this? If you used the models like GPT-2 or 3, they'd tell you a nice story. They wouldn't really be able to solve this. The fascinating thing is the latest state-of-the-art models now start to figure out exactly how to stack this together, where you'll start to see an answer like, first put down the book. And then, anybody have any idea in the next step? Arrange the eggs in a pattern. And so this ability of these models to start thinking like this, to start reasoning like this, these ability to solve these tasks for me is endlessly fascinating and a little bit of the glimpse of the future of what we're going to be able to do with them. But before we jump into what we can do with them, let's talk about how we're building them. If we look at how they're being built right now, I think there's two things I want you to take away from this diagram. One is, as was mentioned in the earlier talk, right, there's relatively few organizations that are building these. But then we see the little lock and unlocked. And there's a wide range between locked and unlocked. But you'll notice that this is a growing trend we have. And the latest AI Stanford report also pointed this out, that just the huge discrepancy we're having between machine learning systems developed within industry versus within academia as well. And so for a lot of people, this is a pause, a bit of concern. When we think about these models, how we're going to use them through the entire life cycle of the data, the training data that we get for them, the model itself, and those predictions, there's quite a bit of concern about these models. I'll try it one more time. Right? And if we look around, it was in the headlines today. The EU, should we ban ChatGPT? Many places have already started this progress, right? We've already seen this. A week or two ago, it was Italy. Now, if we look into what are their concerns, we'll see the concerns are about, we don't understand how these systems operate, what data they were trained on, how the outputs are going to be used. And I want to spend a little bit of time drilling into that. And I want to just start this with a story. So let's talk about Carla here. So Carla's an illustrator. Part of what she likes to do is create art. One of the things she asks is, I like to create the art, but just don't reproduce this without my permission. Seems like a pretty simple thing to ask, but it's one that's not being respected right now. What we see is her art and lots of others being ingested into these systems without any consent. And when we go and we talk to the makers of these systems, they love to give us these long technical reports, right? This GTP4, 100 pages of details with lots of details. Like, we know exactly who's in charge of hardware correctness, right? Who were the people that did the babysitting for training. Many, many details. But they miss just a few little tiny details, right? They forget to tell us about the architecture of the model, the hardware, what training compute was used, the data set that was used, the training method, just little pieces of detail, right? But now you can understand why there's so much concern. It's because there's such a huge gap when it comes to these. But it doesn't have to be this way. Nice zipper. And so if we turn back to Carla, there's other ways that we can solve this problem. Now, at Hugging Face, we've built large language models, and we've dealt with these problems. Part of it is we've worked with the open source, with the community when building these out. So simple things we've done. When we built out a code completion project, we had the ability for people to say, is my code in your data set? If my code is in your data set, can I opt out of that? Didn't take a lot of resources to build, but things that you can do to help give some transparency into the process. Let's talk about the other side, predictions. So one of my favorite types of models are these code completion models, right? If you're a developer, if you're an engineer, even if you're a little part-time into it, it's a lot of fun to have these tools available to you. You can do a lot of work with them. But if we talk to some folks, we talked to Marian here, he played around with these tools, and he got some code that looked like this. And the first two lines probably make sense to most people, but why were there question marks there in that third line? Well, the question marks were there because he used this inside his book as a training exercise, right? And a training exercise that was explicitly not for commercial use. But yet that code was ingested into these systems. And he's not alone. Getty Images had the same issues, where the images they had were pulled into these systems and in their lawsuit grotesquely came out of them. And they've filed lawsuits around this. But again, it doesn't have to be this way. So when we built Santa Coder, a code completion, one of the things we did was give people the ability to search that string that comes out. So if you're in an enterprise setting, one of your developers uses this tool, you could now see, was this a verbatim copy of some code that was already out there on GitHub, or was this entirely new? Again, simple things we can do. All right, so let's talk about the black box here, the middle part of these models. Right? Like, how can we understand these? Especially, right, as I pointed out, we don't have the details of this. So how would we evaluate these models? Well, one of my colleagues, Shah, spent a lot of time figuring out a very technical, might be a little too technical for this audience, but a little technical description of how ChatGPT works. And I'm going to give you a diagram to sum this up. 3 raccoons in a trench coat, because that's really what we know about this system. Now, does this mean we're powerless and we can't do anything? So one of the things we can do is look at the outputs of these models. And we've done that, where we can take a look at the outputs of, for example, DALL-E 2 and see there's quite a bit of diversity of ties when we look at CEOs. While when we look at the Stable Diffusion, we see a diversity of people. So again, you can pick the types of models that work for you. And the consequences of this here, we know for academia that they're not going to be able to study and be part of these models with them closed off. But I work mostly with enterprises. And for enterprises, this is going to be a challenge too. Enterprises want to be able to own the AI and control the AI that they have. And I think this is going to be a major impediment using these boxes tools. But I don't want to be a doom and gloom. I think there's ways that we can improve, and this is where I want to kind of highlight some of the ways we're trying to help and improve. So for example, Hugging Face helped support the Big Science Initiative, which created Bloom, one of the largest open source large language model out there. We've worked on bid code with ServiceNow, building out a code completion. You've seen some early ones there. We've got that ongoing. We're building some more. You saw DeepMind talking about their visual multimodal. We have an open source version of Flamingo that should be out in a while. We've got some fine-tuned. We've got a big cluster. We're firing it up. We've got a lot of large language models coming. But it's not just the models themselves. We're trying to also give people a framework so they can build and use open source tools. So we've built an ecosystem of different packages around. This is just a few of these to help develop that. Beyond that, we have a place, as the Speech Brain folks talked about, a hub, a place where everybody in the AI community can bring their data sets, can bring their models, can share their demos along with the rest of the community. There's other, probably narrower areas that we've spent our time and effort. One is on licensing. Models are a little bit different than classic software in terms of you have data, training code, documentation, model weights. There's also a lot of concern with models that we want to make sure they're used responsibly. So Hugging Face has pioneered working on building licenses like the Rail license, and recently announced the AI Open Responsible Use license as well around this. But really what I want to highlight here is a lot of this open source comes from all of us, from all of you, the community. So if we look at the Transformers package, one of the most widely used packages in machine learning, there's over 1,500 people that have contributed to that. Right? And when we look at Hugging Face, we see there's thousands of people that have contributed to the packages. There's over 15,000 companies that use Hugging Face, hundreds of thousands of people that visit the hub. And for me, this is the part that warms my heart about open source, is I see the power of it. How so many of you want to be involved because you want the control, the ownership of this. And so I'll end with a quick story. So I used to run AI meetups, I still do, in the Chicago area. And for me, getting maybe 100, 150 people at a meetup, is a pretty big deal. A couple weeks ago, our CEO decided to have a meetup out in San Francisco around open source. We initially thought, oh yeah, right, if we can get 200, 300 people there, that would be great. Right? He put the call out. And I know there's some of the people here in the audience that were there, but we put the call out, and we had 5,000 people that came and showed up for this. Right? There's an enormous amount of energy around this area right now, around open source and working with this. And so this is what I kind of leave you with, is that, yes, we have powerful tools and packages, but there's also a powerful community here that wants to be involved, that wants control, wants ownership of these models, and that we're going to support. So I think we have a little bit of time for questions, as well. Am I right on this?
Thank you. Yes, we certainly do. We certainly do. So please hold your hand in the air if you have a question. I can see just over here. We'll get our running mics to you. Just the section in front of the AV booth, towards the back. Keep your hand up, sir. It's coming your way. Physical noise, that's what we need. There we go. We've got arrows from the chat behind you. Excellent work. There we go. Fire away.
Yeah, I think that problem of the open source, that I don't like that term. I like more free software, but it also comes on traditional software, and we have some licenses like GPL version 3. I don't know if it can be applied to models or the limitations, but for example, like if you do something on GPL version 3 and you contribute to it, if someone take that, he's forced to also release it onto that version. Like, I don't know, like for example, the license that you told us, if it takes something of this on account, and also if those traditional free software licenses like GPL version 3 can be applied to models, and what will be the limitations to it?
Yeah. It's a great question, and something that as we think about sharing our models and how they're being used, people think differently about these. And that's what these licenses represent, right? You have some licenses like MIT and Apache, which are just put the model out there, anybody can do whatever they want, right? We have the GPL license, right, that came out of the early work around, is it GNU Linux? I don't know, I would get in trouble for how to say that, right? Where we wanted to make sure that the license, the code that I use, isn't going to be sucked up by some commercial company and just being used for that. Right? There were some people that were concerned about how their software would be used. And I think that's the beauty of all of these licenses, is that we can have a diversity of these licenses. And some of the things that we see right now, in the world of large language models and data sets is we have a lot of non-commercial licenses floating around, where you see researchers sharing out the software, but enterprises, companies aren't allowed to use them. And for me, I'm okay with the diversity of licenses. It's fine. People create these products. They should be able to have some degree of control of how they're actually being used and decide how widely they want to be able to have those shared. So, thanks.
Thank you for a great question. We probably have time for another. I can see just in the front here, in the middle of the second row. I'll be with you in just a moment. Thank you.
You get picked because you're in the front.
Yeah, my eyesight.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you very much for the talk. I had a question about just the way you described the GPT-4 paper. I assume that you think that it should have been open sourced. Is that correct?
So
I have a follow-up just on that, but.
Yeah, so the way the GPT-4 paper, right, 100 pages, very technical, but the concern is that it doesn't explain lots of pieces of the model. Not necessarily saying it should be open source, but there's just an immense opaqueness about exactly what's going on there versus some of the other models that weren't necessarily open source, but at least we had a better understanding of how they were trained, what the architecture of those models was.
Do you think there is a certain point or a certain threshold that we will cross where it would be justified to keep a model completely closed?
So, in the world of software, we have a lot of closed systems. It's entirely okay to have a closed system. Now, but as the buyer, as the user, I also have a right to push back and say, I don't want a closed system. I want something open, because that way I've seen that other people have, for example, rigorously tested it, checked the assumptions of this model, so I feel more comfortable as a safer product. Right? As a government, we have rights when we purchase things to decide whether or not we're appropriate. So anybody can make a black box model. That's totally cool. Like, there's no problem with that. I think it's when you're offering it out, people have the right to kind of push back and say, no, I'd like to know a little bit more about that, especially if my country or all my citizens are now using it like this. So yeah, excellent.
Thank you very much. I think that's all we have time for in terms of questions, but thank you very much, Rajiv. That's really enlightening. And yeah, thank you. Give a huge hand.
Thank you all. And please reach out to me. I'm at Registics. I love doing this type of stuff and also do videos. So
at Registics as
yes.
well. Good work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You. Which way do I exit? Do I go this way?
Yeah.